under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Hamdan bin Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Crown Prince of Dubai and Chairman of the Executive Council. The strategic partner for this year's event is the Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Authority, which many of you will know simply as the FCSA, and we would like to thank them for their vital input. The Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government first launched the UAE Public Policy Forum in 2017. It's an annual discussion platform to bring together government leaders, members of the academic elite, and international experts dedicated to enhancing government policymaking in the UAE and the region. Each year, the forum has tackled a different theme relevant to public policy research. Previous editions have included a focus on education and on public-private partnerships. This year and over the next 2 days, the forum's focus is on the emerging accelerating dynamics for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, just to elaborate briefly on this for the purposes of this introduction, the Sustainable Development Goals are a collection of 17 global goals set by the United Nations in 2015 to tackle social and environmental challenges such as climate change, promotion of clean energy, extreme poverty, gender equality, and sustainable agriculture around the world by 2030. Going forward, as I can see, we're in a room full of experts. We'll just refer to these simply as the SDGs. Now, we all know the UAE is synonymous with ambitious national plans and an unparalleled vision. As a result, the UAE has set clear long-term targets and put in place organizational structures to implement the SDGs over the next decade. This forum provides a platform to allow deep analysis and discussion of critical areas for development, especially in a time of heightened technological and intellectual transformation. Ultimately, the goal of this forum and the reason why we're here for the next 2 days is to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs and to contribute to the drafting of a high-level policy roadmap for the UAE's 2020 to 2030. You will note from your agendas that we'll be hearing from a variety of high-level panels over the next 2 days, and these are going to be injected with Forum Sparks talks. So if you're wondering what those are, think a little bit like a sort of TED talk, but very specific to this event. There'll be brief speeches on stage, and at the close of both days, there will be interactive workshops for you to contribute to and engage in. We'll shortly be starting our first high-level panel discussion, but before we do that, I just want to make a couple of brief but important housekeeping notes. Some of the sessions over the next 2 days will be held in Arabic, others will be held in English. We want to let you know that headsets are available for both Arabic, English, Arabic translation services, and we'll let you know which language will dominate which discussion. The school has published several publications which are highly complementary to the discussions we'll be having over the next 2 days. We'll highlight which one of these best complements the discussion you're about to have. And just to note that these publications aren't available in paper form because this is an event about sustainability and the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government is far too advanced for that. What we will have instead are codes which you can use your smartphone to scan, and that will download the publication onto your phone. You'll find those codes on banners outside of the event hall and also on the screen behind. Each panel is going to have a dedicated moderator to handle the discussion. If they're going to take audience questions, they'll let you know, and you'll be invited to raise your hand at that moment. But until then, we ask you to engage on social media, ask your questions, share your views there. If you want to do that, the official hashtag for doing that is #AcceleratingSDGs. If you want, that will be in Arabic and English to remind you on the screen for the next 2 days. Outside of that, of course, we encourage you to use your phones to engage with social media, but please do ensure they're set to silent so you don't disturb everyone on the stage. Just a note on who I am. My name is Rosanna Lockwood. I'm a Dubai-based broadcast journalist and presenter, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Now we're going to move on to our first forum panel, and the guests of this will be discussing how to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs for future policy frameworks, which I'm sure you'll agree is a fantastic place to start. As noted, there are 2 publications to download that will complement this discussion. The first is the UAE Public Policy Forum 2019 Proceeding Report. That's called Accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals Through Digital Transformation. A secondary publication to read is called Promoting Synergies for the Attainment of Sustainable Development Goals in the UAE Healthcare Sector. Now, I'll shortly be asking the moderator to come to the stage. With the panelists, the moderator will make those individual introductions. But just before we do that, we're going to have these videos that are going to play before the panels. This is the first video, very brief, to provide you with some context for that discussion. Thank you.
Why don't you go
تفضل
there?
بالك on the end.
Sorry.
يعني أسعد الله صباحكم جميعا. أهلا وسهلا بكم في الحلقة النقاشية الأولى من منتدى الإمارات للسياسات العامة في نسخته الثالثة، والذي أطلقته كلية محمد بن راشد للإدارة الحكومية في عام 2017 ليكون ملتقى للقادة وصناع القرار مع قادة الفكر والباحثين وطلاب السياسات العامة. عنوان ومضمون المنتدى لهذا العام هو مسرعات التنمية المستدامة، رسم سياسات المستقبل. من دواعي سرورنا أن يحظى منتدانا لهذا العام بشراكة استراتيجية مع الهيئة الاتحادية للتنافسية والإحصاء لما لها من دور محوري في هذا المجال. نشكر الهيئة ممثلة بمديرها العام سعادة عبد الله الوتاه وفريق عمله المتميز. نشكركم على حضوركم ونتمنى لكم وقتا مفيدا وقيما. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the UAE Public Policy Forum in its third edition titled Accelerating Sustainable Development Goals Future Policy Roadmap. The Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government launched the UAE Public Policy Forum in 2017 to be a platform for policy debate on national priorities, bringing together senior leaders, policy makers, thought leaders, and researchers to discuss major policy directions. This year, we are proud to have with us a strategic partner, the Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Authority, as they play a central role in advocating and coordinating the SDGs. We thank the authority's Director General, His Excellency Abdullah Luta, and his distinguished team. Our forum runs over today and tomorrow and has over 32 international speakers and discusses in various different formats many studies related to different aspects of progress on sustainable development. We also discuss challenges as well as enablers. And as our presenter, our MC mentioned earlier, we have conference proceedings and all related papers on the website, so I encourage you to tap into that. In addition, at the MBR School of Government, we are proud to launch two major publications today. An edited book on future governments in collaboration with the Academy of International Business and Emerald, and this is a book, Future Governments, a number of case studies and perspectives. We'll be launching it today, keeping with the sustainability policy. We haven't printed many copies. However, we have some complimentary copies to be distributed. And if you get yourself a copy, if you don't, you can always check it on Amazon.com. Now, I have to thank here the senior editor, our own Professor Meladina Balakrishnan, for the hard work on this book, and we hope it will be useful for students of policy, policymakers, leaders, and researchers in general. Another major launch we're very proud of today is the inaugural edition of the Dubai Policy Review, مجلة دبي للسياسات, published in both Arabic and English. This is a copy of it. We'll be also distributing copies, again, limited copies of this. You can find it on the website. Search Dubai Policy Review. You can find the whole publication in here. We actually launched this journal in the UAE Policy Forum, this forum, last January in 2017, and we promised to have the first issue launched during this event, and it does feel good to keep promises. That's a good thing. Now, this journal aims to be grounded in academic, scholarly, and empirical research, but the target audience is policymakers, senior leaders, and students of public policy, and we believe it will contribute to the policy debate in the UAE and the region in a quite a strong way. The inaugural issue features articles by world-class thought leaders, including Jeffrey Sachs, Joseph Nye, and Kishore Mahbubani. As I mentioned, we will distribute some hard copies today. I here have to thank the senior editor and our research director, Fadi Salim, and his team for the hard work on this publication. And now we turn to the topic of the panel. Accelerating SDGs, Implementation, Future Policy Frameworks 2030. The major UN announcement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, following on from the Millennium Goals, was welcomed by almost everyone. These were real goals, agreed by countries, and were announced as a definite signal that business as usual is not going to cut it anymore. These goals announced an end to poverty and hunger, universal healthcare, education for all, gender equality, equal access to economic opportunities, renewable energy, healthy environment, among others. 17 major statements supported by 139 targets and hundreds of indicators. This was hailed as a moral compass for the world, a policy blueprint, a program for the people, by the people, for the people of this world. Ambitious and complex. Complex because it's multi-level, multi-stakeholder, interconnected, and it involves a large number of variables to monitor and consider. Importantly, they are not immune to the law of unintended consequences or trade-offs. Can we achieve this by 2030? What main challenges do we face? What policies and strategies do we need to adopt to make it work? This morning, this distinguished panel will, in a way, set the stage for the whole conference. The panel will mainly aim to answer the above questions and the related following ones. How can we accelerate SDGs implementations? Are existing policy frameworks and regulations enabling or hindering implementation? What mechanisms of implementations are emerging today? And how is digital transformation and innovation and the fourth industrial revolution, how can they contribute to accelerating the implementation of these goals? We have here, I think, the perfect panel to discuss this from multiple views, multi-stakeholders. We have UN perspective, we have an international agency perspective, we have academic and research perspective, we have UAE government perspective, we also have business, social entrepreneurship perspective to tackle this issue from all these angles. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the panel to you. I would like to first introduce His Excellency Dr. Yannick Lemerick, former UN Secretary General, His Excellency Adnan Amin, Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, Professor Salman Khashoggi, who is the Director of the Center of Global Health Delivery, Harvard Medical School, Mr. Fadi Ghandour, Chairman of WAMDA and founder of Aramex, and Mr. Malik Al-Madani, Director of the Department of Strategy and Future at the Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Authority. Welcome to all of you. Thank you all so much for your time and effort. You've given us your support to run this panel and this conference, and we appreciate that very much. If I may, if I can start with Dr. Glermick and ask him about where are we now in terms of implementing these goals, and what do you see as major barriers facing achievement of these goals by 2030?
Where do we stand right now? If you look at the global trends, we might have to wait for the end of the 22nd century to achieve some of these goals. For example, it might take 170 years to achieve equal pay between women and men, or 70 years before we achieve universal primary and secondary educations. So clearly, if you look only at trends, we are not in a very good shape. Fortunately, as we will discuss later during this panel, we have plenty of ways to accelerate progress and break trends. But what are some of the big bottlenecks that we'll have to address? One of them is definitely the fact that government is traditionally organized in silos. So you have the Ministry of Water Resources, you have the Ministry of Budget, etc. They think in terms of different time frame, they have a different terminology, different vocabulary, different type of allegiances, and normally they fight with each other whenever budget times comes. This is already pretty bad normally because of the lack of policy coherence. But when it comes to the SDGs, it's a major handicap because the SDGs is an indivisible agenda. Progress or lack of progress on one goal will affect positively or adversarially progress on a few other goals. So I will maybe give 1 minute. Do you have 1 minute to give an example?
Yes, we do,
so
please.
For example, a girl born in a poor family, SDG 1, is much more likely to suffer from chronic malnutrition, SDG 2, with all the consequences in terms of physical and cognitive development, SDG 3. They will be much more likely to drop from school, SDG 4, to be married as a child and exposed to violence from an intimate partner, SDG 5, to have no access to water, no access to energy, 6 and 7, to end up working in the informal sector, to end up exposed to dangerous environmental conditions, suffer from disproportionately from environmental degradation, climate change, to suffer from discrimination, not to be registered at birth, and therefore to be, for example, denied access to justice. You can go for the 17 goals. Huh? And so if you decide to only pick up one that you regard as a priority, you will make no difference to the life of this girl. For example, let's say education, that's basically the silver bullet, that solves everything. This girl is very likely not to go to secondary school to begin with. You can say health, because we have somebody from the health. Well, it's not to be obligatory the problem, because often chronic malnutrition is not because of food shortages. It's not because of a lack of food. And so for the policymakers of tomorrow, it will be important to basically shift from a silo mentality to identifying what are the integrated policy levers that will enable each country to achieve multiple SDGs with one intervention.
Fantastic. I think that's, in terms of setting the scene, coherence, I think, is the key here at the national level and also at the international level. That takes me to Mr. Amin, if I may. How does the picture look on the renewable energy side when it comes to coherence?
Let me say, first of all, I had to get up very early to drive from Abu Dhabi. And when you drive through the desert and you see the sun rising over the desert, it brings out the spiritual part of you. And I was in the UN for a long time, like Yannick, in New York, and I must say it was a divine miracle that we have the SDGs despite the negotiation process, and we have the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, that actually gives a major push to what we're doing on renewable energy. If you look at the SDG negotiation, a very close friend of mine who was our permanent representative to New York from my country was co-chairing that process. And it was, at times, total chaos. So you look at the renewable energy goal. It says substantially increase the share of renewable energy. So at the time we were thinking, what does this mean? Why couldn't they come up with something a little more ambitious? And then you thought, things are moving so fast. Maybe it's a good thing they didn't, because it doesn't create an unrealistic framework around what you're supposed to achieve. So if you look at the policy part, in fact, I think that coherence is very good, but you have to understand that change is going to come from how investment happens, how resources flow, and how important public policy is to making that happen. And in the energy field, if you look at the change over the last few years, today we have 170 countries that have targets on renewable energy. That's up from around 60 about 5-6 years ago. We have, last year, 70% of new power capacity in the global power system was added by renewables. That's a trend for the last 5-6 years. And that is happening on the basis of the business case for renewables, which is happening because the right policy frameworks are in place. I mean, just look at Dubai. I mean, Dubai is like a poster child for us. Because of the policy frameworks that you implemented in Dubai, price discovery through auctions on solar PV is a world record price of around $2 a kilowatt hour, which is 1/3 of what new gas generation is. So these kind of policy frameworks have shifted the needle completely in terms of the perception of what the future of energy is going to be. So in terms of investment, policy has moved in those countries that have been foresighted, but has not moved where those countries have still maintained restrictive practices. But the real problem for policy is going to be that this is unleashing a dynamic with new technologies, which we'll talk about later, which is going to become critical in terms of how you develop policy frameworks around this to change. But let me say, it's very positive what we're seeing. New auctions, new policy platforms, but at the same time, we have to deal with residual issues, you know, like fossil fuel subsidies, which are 5 times more than renewable energy subsidies in the world.
Generally, the energy sector is highly sensitive to politics. And so this turbulence with political changes, I'm sure, affects coherence. Can you give us an example of how policy can deal with that?
We just completed the work of a global commission that we launched called the Global Commission on the Geopolitics of the Energy Transition. And the finding of this commission is very clear, that the future of energy is going to be more and more electrification. That's going to be decentralized and democratized. You're going to have multiple producers and consumers, but it's also going to be based on clean energy and in particular renewable energy, because the cost of these things are coming down. Now, as you try to deal with this issue, what it means is that the power of incumbent industries is really going to be affected. And we can see that across the board. If you look at some of the biggest utilities in Europe, in Germany, that did not anticipate what was happening with renewables. One of them, I won't name which one, is still very sore about it, lost half his market capitalization in 1 year. One of the cast iron solid utilities. They didn't anticipate disruptive change, and this is the lesson of policy. If you don't see the change and you don't adapt to the change that's coming, you can pay the consequences of that very, very quickly.
Thank you very much. That gives us a good view of where we are in terms of energy. And now we turn to health. Professor Salman Khashoggi will tell us about policy coherence and health at the global level.
Well, I have to agree with my colleagues. I think that, if we start looking at these SDGs as separate entities, we're going to run into a problem because they're so interlinked. You think of a disease like diabetes, which affects this region profoundly. Over the next 20, 30 years, there's going to be 700 million people in the world with diabetes. And you often think of it in terms of, well, it's got to do with sugar, it's got to do with what we're putting into our body, and people have to, eat better, exercise more. Very simple messaging. When you start to bring some of this science to bear, you realize that there are a number of factors linked to diabetes. One is people are looking at air pollution and its linkage to inflammation, early heart disease, diabetes, asthma. So when you start to think of the environment and you start to think of renewable energy and you start to think, of these things, it actually has an effect on a disease like diabetes. If you look at changes to our microbiome, the bacteria we have in our bodies, people think that's linked to diabetes. Well, what affects that? Hormones in our meats, antibiotics in our meats, plastics in all of our water and our entire food chain. So again, you start to link some of these issues of environmental degradation and other things with a disease that we think just means that people have to eat better. So you realize that if you really want to give health for a large group of people, and meet these SDG goals, it's not just about injecting people with different things and telling them to eat better. It's really thinking about the environment, the food supply chain, the antibiotic chain. So it's really a multi-sectoral problem. So that's one of the, I think one of the big issues is we're trying to tackle these individually and not looking across and see where the synergies are. The second is inequality. The 2018 report on SDGs shows that the number of people who are living on less than $2 a day has gone down, which is wonderful. That's really a victory. I think that there's been huge steps forward. But still, you're looking at 700 or 800 million people that are living in absolute poverty. And the cutoff is around, I think it's $2 a day or $1.90 a day.
Yeah.
So the number of people that are living in a very dire situation, again, it makes them very vulnerable. And so it makes them vulnerable to a lot of the issues that Yannick brought up, that, ranging from gender inequality to access to education to a number of other things. And so unless we really tackle inequality head on, which means taking on some of the structures of the global economy that perpetuate unequal distribution of resources, I think that that's going to be a very big problem. And then, we've seen in Brexit, we've seen in what's going on in the United States and other countries, there is a response to people feeling that they are disenfranchised and are subject to complex bureaucracies that they can't work through. And you see that, especially for poor people, and I won't name any countries, but there are countries where bureaucracies are so complex that people cannot access services that supposedly they have access to. It really is a myriad of issues. Now, the UAE is not one of those. The bureaucracy is much easier in this country, but in a lot of other countries, there are very complex bureaucracies that are accountable to neither to people above them nor below them in many cases. And so, I think that's also a challenge to populations being able to access things that are, that they should have access to. So, you look at this intersectorial problem, you look at this, the problem of bureaucracies, you look at the problem of inequalities, and all of them are completely fixable, but they're challenges towards us achieving that goal.
Thank you. So again, it's the complexity and the coherence, I think, is the message we're getting so far. And if I may turn to Mr. Ghandour and ask him from his perspective, from business perspective, social entrepreneurship perspective, third sector perspective, what do you see as challenges facing implementing these ambitious goals?
So, I think the biggest challenge for the private sector at this stage and for government, since everything is interconnected, even civil society, is how do you actually mobilize the private sector to be part of this process? There is a massive lack of awareness on the private sector side of what the SDGs are, what their role is within that, how do they conduct themselves, how does the private sector think of itself in terms of development? Is it part and parcel of the development process? How does it find opportunities in the SDGs? Because a lot of the challenges in the SDGs are effectively opportunities that you can get people on the entrepreneurial sector, in social entrepreneurship, and in the big industries to come out and solve these issues. I see that is a big challenge today, specifically in markets that are lesser developed. I think it is much more an elitist story today, so you will find them discussing it at Davos, and Davos is a super elitist organization. It doesn't trickle down. It doesn't go to small and medium-sized enterprises, and it doesn't go into local businesses and local industries that don't get invited to the big table that discusses these issues. So there is a big section of society that is not participating, and that is not even aware of the issues that we are talking about. While in reality, they are a big part of either influencing SDGs positively or negatively for that matter. So there is that gap. There is an opportunity, obviously, in getting and mobilizing society and mobilizing civil society and the business sector to actually come out and partner with the public sector. The governments need to understand that if you want to not have the SDGs being achieved where the undersecretary was mentioning in 70 or 20 years, or meeting the targets in 30 years, then you need to get all of society mobilized. This is not a strictly public sector story. Yes, the policy will be set by the public sector, and yes, partially the public sector might be in the implementation of these policies on the ground, but the reality of the matter, it has to trickle down to all of society to be an implementing part. And I'll tell you, so I know this region well, I don't see that happening today. So there is lack of knowledge, there is lack of awareness, there is lack of thinking that it is the job other than government. So either government says, it's only my job, I don't want anybody to be involved in it, or the private sector also does not take up its responsibility and says, if you want it, you take it. We're outside of this realm, we'll do what we want, and then you end up with practical disasters, and it could affect peace, it could affect prosperity, it could affect, and we see what is happening in many areas in our region where when society and civil society collapses, talking about Syria, then it affects the world. And you have the issues of populism, you have the issues of anti-immigration and anti-migrants. Does this affect the private sector? Does this affect Europe? Does this affect the developed world? Absolutely. And that's why, in my view, we as a private sector, unless you have these leaders who are aware by themselves, there is nobody that is waking them up and saying, you have to own that story with us. And I think that's a big challenge.
So there is a disconnect, as you see, between public and private.
Yeah, but it's a trust issue also, doctor. So I mean, there is that mistrust between public and private sector institutions, and I don't see that there is an institute. I'm not specifying a specific country, but there is no institutional process of how to break those barriers and actually get everyone to be owning their story and participating in it.
Right, I think it's a good time now to bring government in. And Malik, you're in the hot seat here. Government does not reach out. It's not connecting the dots. Is it solely the role of government? What's your view?
First, I'd like to thank our great panelists here sharing their insights and their view of how SDGs can be achieved or how it can be accelerated. As Dr. Yannick, I'd like to thank you for noting that a challenge for policymakers would be to work on achieving the goals in an integrated manner rather than working on silos. And Mr. Fadi, thank you for pointing out that it's not only government who's going to be involved or should be involved in achieving the goals. In the UAE, as we all know, these same goals have been declared in 2000. While in 2010, UAE Vision 2021 was launched. 2014, the National Agenda was launched. This internal or national agenda has been designed in a way where having a world-class healthcare system, healthcare, education system, and educational system is also related to having a knowledge-based economy. So having these goals interlinked is something that we have been working on for years now. And one of the mechanisms that have been developed by government to ensure that we all work together to achieve our national agenda is to launch the national executive teams. As you are aware, the United Arab Emirates is split into federal government, local government. There are also free zone authorities, in addition, of course, having the private sector involved in the development of the country. I think there has been efforts to include all those together in order to achieve our national agenda. We are using same techniques and building on them, and based on the lessons we learned over the years, how to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. The UAE, in its first efforts to tackle this global agenda, has created the National Committee on SDGs, where it is mainly federal entities as the 17 members, but we have expanded horizontally. We have included the private sector. So now we do have a private sector advisory council that was launched back in the World Data Forum in October, that was held in Dubai. That is a step in the effort of trying to include the voice of the private sector, of how they can advise the government team on how to best achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Another expansion horizontally is to include the youth. I think including the youth in policy making is a key trigger, especially for our region. That is challenging, that is difficult, and many of its challenges is relating to listening to the youth. Actually, in these few days, since 2 weeks now, we've been receiving applications in FCSA. We had more than 600 applicants, has been filtered to 400 to 100. Our goal is to have 10 great young individuals, Emiratis and non-Emiratis living in the UAE. This council will be aiming to advise the same government team, the National Committee on SDGs, on how best to meet the national agenda and how to consider moving forward. And also, how can the UAE not only achieve it for itself, but how can it contribute to the world? How can it help other countries as well to achieve it by 2030?
Thank you very much. That's really good. That's good view on what's happening in the UAE, and I'll come back to you with a few more questions as well as the discussion progresses. I'd like to pick up on one point that I was just mentioned towards the end, which is the business and public and private working together. And there has been a lot of criticism that there is a divide. The short-term gains are not very clear. Long-term gains are clear, but short-term are not. How do you incentivize private business to actually see these long terms and work with you? Perhaps I can ask Dr. Yannick about the UN experience in trying to do that. How do these dynamics work? You get generally individuals who are wealthy, companies who are wealthy, who want to do their own thing. Corporate social responsibility, charitable and all that. And there is some criticism that it's not always in line with the Sustainable Development Goals or may have unintended consequences. What policies, what ideas do you have to advise governments on how to collaborate better with private business?
If I can look only at the industry of, the two of us have worked quite a lot on the renewable energy and climate change throughout our careers. There are more than 4,000 policies, public policies on climate change, and more or less
4,
about 4,000. And there are also more than 4,000 policies on the renewable energy. So you have plenty of choice when it comes to basically providing a very clear, coherent policy framework for private sectors to make their decisions. And you can also provide use public policy to improve the risk-reward profile of investment, to make it much less risky and much more profitable to invest in low-carbon investment rather than in high-carbon investment, to invest in projects that will deliver a lot of social dividend rather than projects that will expose a private sector to basically a popular resentment that could jeopardize their license to operate. So there are plenty of public policy makings that can promote this kind of whole of society that Freddy has mentioned. For me, when one of the key tasks of the public policy makers of tomorrow will be, out of these 4,000 policies for climate change, 4,000 policies for energy, how do you come with the best mix of public policies, let's say for the UAE? And because it will vary from one country to another one. I've spent a big part of my career on developing mathematical models to try to identify the optimal mix of public policy. And all of that in a kind of laboratory type environment where people do not exist, where you end up with the mathematically correct answer. If there is one thing I've learned throughout my career, is that there is no mathematically correct answer to policy decision making. Policy decision making is fundamentally a political exercise, and you have to work with people. So once you believe that you have you have identified what are the main policy bottlenecks, that you have a portfolio of solutions, it's really important to work with all the stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, make sure that you do not develop as policymakers a policy in a vacuum, to take a true whole of society approach, because very likely the civil society, academia, the private sector will tell you, but actually you have completely overlooked that. And if you do this, you will most likely improve your public policy impact. There is another challenge. This was already a challenge 10 years ago, but there is another challenge with the SDGs. One of the ambitions of the SDGs is to leave no one behind. And we know that most policies do not benefit the poor like they benefit the rich. They do not benefit women like they benefit men. And this we have done it for a long time. For example, Anatole France had a quip saying, the law in its magnificence forbids to the poor or like to the rich to beg in the street, to steal bread, and to sleep under bridges. And we often forget this basic truth. Policy will not affect everybody alike. And so another key challenge for the policymakers of tomorrow, beside working in an integrated approach, beside adopting a whole of government approach, will be to assess the differentiated impact of a given policy on everybody. And often it's not to come with a new policy. It will be about tweaking your policy to make sure that they benefit everybody alike.
And then let me pick on this point a bit further. You mentioned earlier that each country will have, to some extent, its own policies. However, the whole idea of SDGs is coherence at the global level. How much flexibility will you give individual countries in having their own policies versus collaborating with others and working across borders? Because private businesses today are cross borders. So if you have different policies in different countries of the world, especially in one region, won't that affect negatively the economic development?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I'm concerned about not taking too much time, but I would like to take a couple of minutes on it because it's really a fundamental point. First, the private sector is often your ally when it comes to policy coherence. The Clean Air Act in 1917 in the United States, which was to regulate the automobile industry, was actually supported by the automobile industry. Why? It's because they had a patchwork of state-level regulation in the United States. They had a patchwork of state-level regulation, one in California, one in Kentucky, etc. And for them, there was a major threat to an economy of scale. They wanted to have one national, one federal standards that will enable us to come with one product. And that's true also now in our highly globalized world. The private sector needs basically to have global standards. One of the ambitions of the SDG agenda is to enable this kind of dialogue among countries on what kind of standards they are putting in place. As part of the implementation process of the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, you have now a high-level political forum that review voluntary submission of progress report. Since 2016, when it started, it's 102 countries, if my memory is correct, that have submitted voluntary national reviews, and 41 more this year. So basically, it's almost 150 countries, most of the countries of the world, which have said, what am I planning to do? And this is a huge wealth of information first for any country to say, oh, they are doing this, that's the integrated policy that they are using to achieve 5 SDGs, that's the way we do universal health care. So it's a major source of insight in terms of policy. It's also a major source of information to increase the coherence and to come with some policies that supports everybody.
Thank you. Mr. Ghandour had
so
a comment.
I would add a couple of things. I think the private sector needs to move from its mentality of thinking that CSR is participating in development or in getting issues solved or addressing the challenges of SDGs. I think CSR is becoming much more PR-ish than it is actual, real, embedded in the business processes. There is a big challenge, specifically among public companies, and this is where policymakers can come in. Are we going to require the public sector to report sustainability and the responsibility of that these private companies who have gone either public or conducting themselves in society? Do they need to report beyond financial reporting and start reporting sustainability reporting? Some companies who are at the forefront of this are doing dual reporting.
Good practice.
And doing dual reporting, does it become a policy? Or is it because a CEO of a company is enlightened and he thinks, okay, like Paul Paulson at Unilever, and says, you know, Paul, what's his name? The CEO of Unilever. Anyway, so he is a visionary, and he goes out and says we need to do sustainability reporting, we need to focus on society, etc., etc., etc. But he's a visionary. What will happen when he leaves and now he's just left? Is this left behind? Or is it going to be policy that requires that? And there is a big and huge problem, specifically in the West and maybe in the United States of America, suddenly, the unpredictability of policy. So who am I going to follow as a private sector? Am I going to follow an administration that said, yes, I am going to be for the Paris climate agreement? Or am I going to follow another administration that says, well, you know what, we are not so sure about where we stand on this issue, and then the private sector slips through the cracks and hides behind gray areas for that matter. And so these paradoxes are serious and real on the ground, not only in emerging markets. Maybe there is much more predictability nowadays in emerging markets than there is in much more developed markets. And so the investor community needs to also think about it, because investors in many countries now are saying to the private sector, please focus only on profitability, profit maximization, and leave other issues to somebody else. So where does government come in and actually regulate that story and put us in the private sector in front of our responsibilities?
These are very good points. Jeffrey Sachs, in his article in our journal, talks about issues with regulation with regards to tax havens and tax reforms, and there are incentives for private business not to actually engage in sustainable development at the right level, regulation-wise. Before we move to innovation, I still would like to hear from Mr. Amin and Professor Salman on the private public connect or disconnect in their respective fields. And there are different practices. I'm not an energy expert, but when I look around, I see that the major investment coming in renewable energy, for example, in the UAE is public sector. I could be wrong, but it seems like the public sector is actually leading. But where is the private sector? What is their role?
Well, I just want to agree with the last point. The point of the private sector is profit. The private sector was not established as a benevolent organization. I think the private sector operates within a social and political context, and it's the drivers of that social and political context that determine in a way how the private sector reacts to that. And I think that as we live now in an era of fast-moving change, climate change is coming to the top of people's minds. Paul Paulson was one of those early people talking about it. He's no longer there. But I think that the pressure on the private sector is for more transparency and for more responsibility, either environmental responsibility or social responsibility, and that has to be internalized in their operations in a much more fundamental way. They need to understand that their own survival is not dependent on government policy per se. It's also dependent on the perception of consumers of how these companies are operating more and more. That's why they're doing it. They're not doing it just because they're nice people. They might be nice people, but they're compelled to do it also. And I think that is the compulsion that we need to work on, which is how does public policy create a framework for implementation, moving towards addressing global risks, moving towards taking the SDGs forward, that creates a playing field of transparency where actors make rational decisions that go in the right direction. And if you look at the evolution of policy over time, just take a very clear example of how in the renewable space, we moved from the feed-in tariff when technology was very expensive, which was a subsidy, to now competitive auctions where price discovery is being pushed lower and lower. As I said, 2 cents a kilowatt hour in some markets. The people who fought the change from the feed-in tariff to the auctions and discovery and price discovery were the private sector because they were making huge profits from the subsidies they were getting over long-term tariffs. So we don't expect the private sector to be the social agent of change. It is foresighted public policy that is the agent of change.
Okay, thank you very much. In the health arena, private-public synergy or private-public friction, how do you see it?
Well, I just want to pick up from what Fadi was saying, because I think it's such an important point about the role of the private sector in society. I mean, people look at the writings of Adam Smith and say, oh, you know, this invisible hand of the market. But we forget that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. And, you know, in his writing, even in The Wealth of Nations, he says that regulations are good when they benefit the worker and the poor in society. And so I think, you know, what we've allowed in our societies is that the private sector thinks it's separate from the rest of society. And so corporate social responsibility takes on this PR-ish aspect, as you pointed out, rather than being a player in society that's part of it, right? So there's nothing against wealth generation. That's good, but when you have it, you should share. And really how you should share is then what becomes the question. So I think there's a fundamental, for me, there's a fundamental misconception that the private sector is just there to make money, shareholder value, and has nothing to do with anything else that goes around. I think that is what has to be imbued in corporate social responsibility. And that maybe happens through regulation and through reporting requirements and things like that. So I think that's part of it. Now, the private sector, I'll tell you, I've been working in the field of tuberculosis, treatable disease, kills 10 million, affects 10 million people a year, kills 2 million people. The biggest pushers of change to increase access have been the private sector. Companies like Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Qiagen, like all the, you know, inventors of new drugs, inventors of old drugs, people who are in the market, who are not in the market, have really tried to push the agenda of healthcare delivery in ways that, you know, that are very, very innovative. They've gone against the WHO, which has normally recommended mediocre or low standards for poor countries. They've gone against, you know, some national policies that you know, relegate people to low standards of care. So, you know, the private sector, for various reasons, including the profit motive, have really tried to push the agenda and improve access to care. Hepatitis C, completely treatable disease today. It's treatable and curable, right? But the drugs are expensive. And again, you've had, you know, voluntary licensing and things like that happening. So there's ways to involve the private sector that I think don't necessarily encroach on its space, but really allow it to bring innovation into the field.
I think thank you for all these interventions. I think it's an old debate. I'm not sure we're going to sort it out today, but public and private, and I think some of us dreamers here think that there is a wonderful argument to be made is that countries can continue to accumulate wealth, individuals can continue to make wealth, companies can continue to make money, but everybody benefits, and that I think is probably a dream, but we'll see. Maybe a public policy will be formulated to deal with that. If we can move to the second part of this discussion on innovation, digital transformation, fourth industrial revolution, call it what you will. How can these innovations, this technology actually advance sustainable development goals in real ways. And if you can give us examples from your fields and suggestions to enhance policy in that direction, that would be wonderful. And I'd like to start with Malik here and see from the National Committee and from the FCSA, from his own points of view, how does that work in the UAE and the region?
I think basically science, innovation, and digital transformation are a key to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The government is very aware of that. If I start with innovation, so back in 2015, His Highness Sheikh Khalifa, the President of the UAE, has declared 2015 to be the year of innovation. And by that declaration, certain steps have been happening in government. A national strategy on innovation has been launched, the first edition. The second edition was launched last year. Now, the idea to bring everyone together on innovation is that we need to have an innovative government, innovative private sector, innovative individuals. And through each pillar, certain milestones and actions have to be done. One example in relation to innovative government. So in addition to providing the relevant training, bringing the thought leaders of innovation and train our government officials for our government to be relevant for the future. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed basically says, either you innovate or you become extinct. إما الابتكار أو الاندثار. So a new function has been created in the federal government. It's called the Chief Innovation Officer. Now, that function is asked to strengthen or to foster a culture of innovation, a way of thinking. It's not something separate from what the entity would do. And therefore, this function is asked to bring everybody together, integrate the innovative thinking into the main core businesses. If we talk about the fourth IR, I think the attitude of the UAE government now is we can always experiment. We shouldn't be afraid of the wave of fourth industrial revolution. I think many people discuss how, let's say, many people will not be having jobs that they have today. But the way we speak to the government is that no, but there are other jobs that can be created with the fourth IR. What are the steps that the government has been taken to take a lead or be on the top of the wave, let's say, of fourth industrial revolution? In the Global Future Councils, it's an event that the UAE Prime Minister Office does with the World Economic Forum yearly. They've been discussing a few years back about the importance of the fourth industrial revolution, AI, etc. What was the first step that the government has done? One of the first steps, a change in cabinet. We have a Minister for Artificial Intelligence. Today, there are strategies, the UAE strategy on fourth IR and the strategy on AI. Therefore, we do believe that these are very important for our own national development and to also achieve the SDGs, I would say.
How do you feel about, the question really isn't how do you feel, but what do you think about regulations? When it comes to innovation and all these new technologies, laws and regulations are not always conducive, they're not always supportive, because they generally are, obviously, the legislative cycle is quite slow. So when we talk, for example, about flying taxis, electric cars, a number of new innovations do require more progressive legislations and faster cycle of legislation. What's your view on regulations in the UAE with regards to innovation?
We do believe that regulations have to change and has not only to, because some regulations have been there since the establishment of the UAE, or it's been there since the 80s and the 90s. They were relevant at the time. Now, for example, the UAE government is not talking about having an electronic government, but having a future government. We're not only interested to solve the policy issues of today, but we want the great, alhamdulillah, the great quality of life that we have today to remain for the next generations. So I think that there are a lot of efforts into changing those regulations. There are certain tools, I'll mention one of them, the UAE Government Accelerators Program. The spirit of that is to identify challenges today or of the future. So the near future is what are the challenges to achieve the nearest milestone, which is the UAE National Agenda 2021. The much further one is the UAE Centennial 2071. His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Zayed said we want to celebrate the last barrel of oil. But from today, we have to be thinking how to create that economy that will actually celebrate the last barrel of oil. Going back to the government accelerators, the core of that is not to solve a challenge within 100 days or a short period of time, but to bring everyone together. Government officials, private sector, include them all to talk about or to discuss how we can solve things together. We would like to always involve the private sector and to let them be part of sharing the responsibility with the government in order to achieve sustainability.
I think that's correct. And I just recalled now while you're talking, I wasn't thinking about it when I asked the question, but I recall now the announcement that was made a couple of weeks ago that the President, His Highness Sheikh Khalifa, has authorized the cabinet that in certain cases with new innovations and inventions to actually provide exceptions in order for trials to take place, because that is an important real life, not just lab experiments, but real life trials to take place to push this and advance it. And I think that's definitely a key thing. We see this in education. People talk about it in health and other areas where current regulations may not always be what you need, and develop them fast enough is not an option. So you do need an accelerator or a fast track to actually achieve that. If I may ask Mr. Amin to tell us about how does innovation and technologies, how do they give a push to renewable energy at all levels? And if you can give us some examples, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you. I will. But let me first of all say very interesting comments. And the Minister of Artificial Intelligence happens to be extremely young, brilliant man who understands artificial intelligence much better than I ever could, because my generation is in a completely different technological mind frame. And I think the importance of the youth is not just to say that this is your future, you need to be more active. They understand things in a very different way. So I just wanted to make that point. But on technology innovation in renewables, we are seeing a level of dramatic change that is driving all kinds of trends. One is a major cost reduction trend. So innovation in some of the mainstream renewable technologies like wind and solar today has driven the cost of technology in the last 8 years. Solar PV dropped by 73%. Wind has dropped by about 30%. They're generating power today much cheaper than anywhere else. But with it has brought huge changes. The challenge of how do you manage variability in the system. And here the advent of storage has been equally remarkable, because cost of battery storage has fallen by about 60% in the last decade, and we expect 60% in the next decade. Within 2-3 years, we expect storage to be competitive on the grid, and the variability issue for renewables will be manageable. We're seeing the advent of electric mobility with the future of electrification from renewables, electric mobility. These are the elements of innovation that may actually allow us to reach a level of decarbonization that keeps us in a safe world in the future. For me, the energy sector is crucial to this because it accounts for 2/3 of emissions. And there's a host of other innovations that we're seeing in business models, but the interesting one is in the off-grid space. Everybody thinks that poor people who don't have access to modern energy service are helpless and not able to innovate and so on. What we're seeing is that for the first time, because of innovation in new systems for off-grid, which can provide at very low cost solar solutions for the household, which can be managed remotely by mobile phone, has dropped to a point where it is affordable. And for the first time, we have less than 1 billion people who are without access to electricity. The figure was always around 1.2 billion. Just in the last 5 years, 133 million people have been electrified, and the vast majority of them are from renewable solutions. So this is all changing. I think the real challenge now is going to be, as we digitalize the system, as it's more and more decentralized. I mean, in Germany, there are 6 million people selling electricity to the grid. How are you going to manage all of this? So I think the advent of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and in particular blockchain trading, and blockchain is essentially a ledger that allows you to track in real time how these transactions are happening, has allowed a new type of market design to emerge for a renewable electricity future, which allows you to manage this much more flexibly, allows you to trade electricity in segments of minutes rather than days or hours, and to create a much more flexible system with intelligent learning that allows you to manage variability in very new ways. So I think this is something that's emerging that's a game changer in terms of decarbonization and energy future. And you're already beginning to see there are some countries which are front runners in this. And I would say, looking at what is happening in the UAE, and I'm familiar with many of these issues, is that this is one of those countries.
That's good news on the cost of development going down, and perhaps this will fast track a lot of the sustainable development goals, because energy obviously is a center of all that. Dr. Yannick, from your view, technology, innovation, sustainable development, how do you see it going?
When we often put policy and technology and innovation in the same sentence, most of the discussion turn around what kind of policy roadblock exists that have to be lifted in order to foster innovation, or what kind of policies could be used to accelerate innovation. When it comes to policies and innovation, for me, I'm much more concerned about what kind of policies are needed to ensure that innovation serves societal goals. Technology does not have a mind of its own. Technology has no agency, at least as long as we do not reach a singularity. Human have agency. And one thing we know is that a technology can deliver public goods as it can deliver public bad. It very much depends about the policy framework that we put in place. Tomorrow I will have a forum spark only on this issue, but maybe today I will only take one example. Driverless cars. A car is idle 94% of the time. And potentially, if you move toward driverless car, you could reduce the number of cars on streets by 80%. And so it means that you could accommodate the 100% increase that we expect in terms of mobility needs in the coming years. You could reduce the number of roads. You could convert a lot of roads into large pavement. You could use this pavement actually to increase the resilience of the cities by planting trees, by having storm surge as substitution. So with a driverless car, you could reduce the traffic. You could reduce the investment needs. You could improve the quality of commuting, and you could increase the resilience of cities to climate change. That, I would say, is the cornucopian scenario. Yes. That's the techno-optimist scenario. And right now, you have a number of techno-evangelists that go all over the world to sell that vision. And it might be where we will end up. But it might not be also, because there is an opposite scenario, which is that with a driverless car, we will reduce the cost of a mile by 60–70%. So it will become so cheap to take a driverless car that people will not take public transport. And so there will be no more investment in public transport. And so for the poorest, they will end up with not enough money for a driverless car and no more alternative in terms of public transport. And even for those who can afford the driverless car, because everybody wants to have that car, actually we will increase the number of cars on the street. We will have to invest a fortune in new road networks. We will increase the vulnerability of our cities to climate change. And that's the same technology. And we have I would say, this doomsday scenario, the techno-pessimist scenario, it's not something that I just dreamed out. For example, we have had several cities in the world that have postponed investment in public transport because they have said, public transport, that's the transport of the 20th century. We are waiting for the transport of the 21st century, driverless car. So what is the difference for me between the techno-optimist and techno-pessimist scenario? It's policies, public policies. And the technology will basically do what we steer us to deliver. And unfortunately, the history of the world shows that we often have to go through a period of trials and error before fixing up our technologies. When it comes to climate change, we have 12 years to take action. We don't have the time to to go through a period of trials and errors, especially not with infrastructure that stack us in a model for 50 to 100 years. And therefore, once again, we will need the public policies with a lot of foresight, to take back to your expression. Go back to your expression.
I like very much the driverless car example, because I think it gives us a case study for policy coherence at, for example, urban planning level, at least. Just that. That will require a lot of work. So policy people should get busy in order for that to actually happen and get to the optimistic scenario. Professor Salman, if you can tell us about what's happening with technology and SDGs.
Yeah, can I also talk about innovation? Because
yes, you can.
One of the things about innovation in healthcare is I think it's not all technological. Some of it is, and I want to talk about that in a second. But when you think about it, 20th century health systems are very hospital focused. 21st century disease epidemiology is chronic diseases. And when you start to think of chronic diseases, you realize that they're best not treated in the hospital. They're best treated in the communities where patients live and work. So we've spent a lot of time translating laboratory findings into the clinic, which has been a great translational effort. How do we translate what's happening in the clinic into the communities where patients live and work? And that requires technology. Certainly people think of handheld technologies and digital cyber technologies that can, check your blood sugar levels and, transmit it to your doctor and all sorts of things. So I think that there's a lot of room, in those areas. But we also have to think about the structures of our health system and the innovations we have to make to do community-based delivery and link that community-based delivery to primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare networks. So that's, that's one of the areas that I think is really important. The other thing is that, if you look at poverty, for example, or if you look at poverty and health, there's been a lot of innovation in the last 10 or 15 years around conditional cash transfers. Really thinking about how do you bring people out of poverty, and in so doing improve educational outcomes, improve health outcomes. Brazil is an amazing example. They created a program, the Bolsa Familia program, which gave money to families to put kids in school. It ended up actually increasing entrepreneurship in those families, increasing the quality of food eaten by those families, and increasing health outcomes, and it brought 35 million people out of poverty. So, very, very innovative public policy. And of course, they're not the only ones. Mexico has it, Oportunidades, Nicaragua has it. There's a number of people. Prime Minister Modi in India announced conditional cash transfers for tuberculosis patients just a few months ago. There's a lot of people thinking of innovations of how to use social bonds. How do you bring private capital? Governments can't do everything themselves. How do you bring private capital to bear on some of these problems, building the health systems that we need? So, the reason I don't want to stress the technology is that sick people actually need care and compassion, and that actually involves humans, and that actually involves giving those humans technology, but really having trained humans and rethinking the way we do our health system. And I just want to, I know that we're running out of time, but I want to give an example from tuberculosis again, because that's an area that I work in. Here's a disease that's had a cure since 1947. It causes 10 million people get it. 2 million people die from it today in this world. And it's completely treatable and largely preventable. And so, our group started something called Zero TB Cities, where we wanted to try and get cities, usually incubators of innovation, to take on doing a comprehensive approach to stopping TB. And it's been a real eye-opener of how you have to bring together these sectors to, to achieve our sustainable development goals. Because you go to a city and they say, well, what do we need to do to stop families from getting TB? Well, you need to screen them with x-rays. And they say, oh, we don't have enough people to read the x-rays. Well, that's solvable. In fact, the UAE is spearheading, through the Ministry of AI, is spearheading artificial intelligence x-ray readers, so that you could take the x-rays, it gets read, and you're told who the highest risk people are. So that's one piece. Fantastic. Then people say, oh, we don't have enough x-ray machines. I'll take an example of any city in India. Well, we don't have enough X-ray machines. You walk outside of where you're having the meeting saying there's not enough X-ray machines, and there's an X-ray provider here, and an X-ray provider there, and a lab here, and another one there. And you realize, oh, you actually just need to have the Uber of X-rays, or the Uber of labs, or Airbnb, or whatever.
Shared economy.
So you need the Kareem of X-rays. You need to be able to link. There is capital resources that are there, that are available, that are not being linked to to a problem at hand. And of course, an X-ray is a very basic thing. Most primary healthcare clinics in the world don't have it. So you start to realize that digital technology linked to things that are already out there. The X-ray was invented in 1895. It's obviously gotten a bit better since then, but the digital technologies, AI, can help solve a problem like TB and many other problems, lung cancer, asthma, COPD, other things. So we have to have innovation across multiple levels where we're integrating the technology.
Thank you very much. And we're wrapping up here. We've got very few minutes to go. But if I can ask Mr. Ghandour for his perspective on innovation and sustainable development.
And I think a lot has been said about this, but let me add a couple of things here. So part of the SDGs is on innovation and entrepreneurship and education. So if we think of all those three, and think that you are going to connect academia with the business, research and development, with the business sector, with the private sector, and with the investor community and government, so that you can create an entrepreneurial process, starting with universities, at R&D. How do we address challenges in society and solve for them in the digital economy? And create an entrepreneurship ecosystem starting at the education level, very early on, going in and saying, solve these problems, they become investable. How do we take R&D to commercialization? How do we take R&D into implementation on the ground? How does government become the pilot sites? And I think, as has been said earlier, the UAE is a poster child of this. The Dubai Future Foundation and the acceleration programs is about that. It is basically telling innovators from a global level. So, I mean, Dubai and the UAE is a connecting and a connector society. So they're basically saying, if you have a solution for a societal problem that we have, or within your own society, come, we'll accelerate you. We'll find you the government agency to actually test your product, and then you can disseminate it across different, it could become a for-profit or not for-profit, but you're solving for a problem on the ground. So you're effectively involving youth, involving entrepreneurship, involving education, involving government, involving the private sector, and involving the investor community to actually participate together for solving for problems on the ground. And I think that's a big challenge and a big opportunity here.
Thank you so much.
Just a small point, which I think we need to be aware of the fact that all of this requires a lot more interconnection, intelligent systems, electrical interconnection of thousands, billions of devices to a system, and that raises the issue of cybersecurity. And what we are seeing increasingly is the vulnerability of these systems to potential attack. This is going to become a major issue that we need to give attention to.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And all these are very important points, and we at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government try to do our share in supporting sustainable development. We do have a research track in sustainable development that mainly produced this conference, but we also have launched a year and a half ago a master's in public policy in sustainable development, and the idea is to discuss, promote, and research these matters. And in fact, I don't mean to put Malik on the spot, but perhaps I will. Last Thursday, he and I were discussing this, and we agreed that the authority will support the program with research, with data, with guest speakers, in order to make it more relevant and make it more in line with the agenda. So we contribute to the coherence and integration as much as possible. Malik, I only have 30 seconds if you want to say something about that.
Yes, so I think we had a discussion last week regarding how can we collaborate as government and academia into promoting SDG. I think also before that, we were thinking FCSA, how can we best achieve our core businesses? Having a strong statistical system, putting the UAE on the top of the competitiveness indicators, whether regionally or at some time in the world, and dealing with the sustainable development goals. And the answer was education. We cannot do it alone. We cannot do it and achieve it alone, FCSA. We need to basically educate, whether it's a government workforce or students, academia, even the private sector. We had an initiative called Bayt al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, where we are trying to integrate all of our efforts in FCSA relating to building knowledge or transferring knowledge, but working with an academic institution that this is their core business actually. The way where we'll work together, I think we agreed on launching a MPP, basically a Master of Public Policy on SDG and competitiveness, where we'll be supporting by providing content, and we'll work together on how to best deliver.
Thank you so much. That would be wonderful, and we do appreciate that the school. And further thing we're doing to support that today, for example, we're joining the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the United Nations Network. That'll be good. In terms of also education, we're signing an agreement with Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University to learn from them the online learning. Their experience is very is important in that field. Online learning is part of sustainability because it's a wider reach, and hopefully all these efforts will come to fruition, and we will do our own little but important contribution to the subject at hand. I thank you all so much. Your candid views, your experience, and your willingness to share it was, I think, appreciated by the audience. You've started I think, our conference today and tomorrow on the right path. We've identified the high-level issues. We've got, obviously, coherence issues. We've got integration issues. The matter is really complex. Technology can help, but not without humans. It's not going to do it alone. Technology and us. We will work together, and I think that's a very important point. And I really do take the point that I think Mr. Amin mentioned, and also Malik earlier. There is a lot of anxiety when we talk about artificial intelligence and technology, because a lot of people who preach it end up really providing us with that anxiety, because they tell us you will be replaceable, you're not important anymore, your jobs will be gone, AI will do all your work. And I think perhaps that's the wrong approach. I think it should be how AI and technology can make my job easier and better and more effective, and reduce my stress and anxiety and raise my happiness, yet again contributing to sustainable development goals. Thank you all very much. Thank you, distinguished panel.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.